If you're just joining us again, welcome to the 2021 Cybersecurity Outlook for Business webinar. My name is Gary Arnold. I am the marketing manager at Executech, and I am excited to welcome our three panelists today, three cybersecurity experts from some of the leading technology companies in the nation, if not the world. Some international players here. I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists briefly here as more of you join in. The first one I'm going to introduce is James Slaby. James is the Director of Cyber Protection at Acronis. Acronis is a leader in data protection and cyber tools. Welcome, James. James S., as I will refer to you going forward, as we do have two James joining us.
Thanks, Gary. Great to be here.
Thank you. We also have with us Brad Hanley, the pre-sales system engineer for Arctic Wolf. Arctic Wolf is a leader in cyber risk and security operations services. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks for having us, Gary.
Thanks. And then finally, of course, we're joined by James Fair. James is a regular webinar attendee for our Executech webinars. James is the Senior Vice President of Technical Operations at Executech. Welcome, James.
Thank you all. Glad to be here. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. I know that we'll have a few attendees trickle in over the next couple of minutes. As I mentioned, we are recording this webinar, and so if they miss it or come late, of course, we'll have a recording available. But we will go ahead and get started. I don't want to take too much time today. I want to try and keep this a little bit shorter than maybe your average webinar. Our goal is to keep this 45 minutes or under. And so we're going to breeze through a lot of questions, and hopefully we can have a very engaging panel discussion. And again, if you have any questions at any time, whether it's about logistics of the webinar or a question for our panelists, please submit that in the chat, as we will be taking live questions at the end and possibly as they come if it fits to our discussion. To get started, I want to do a quick little loosener for our panelists and 3 rapid fire questions for each of you. So, and I'll start with, in my screen here, I've got James Slaby in the top, James S. Favorite smartphone app? Ready, go.
Overcast. It's a cool podcatcher. I listen to a lot of podcasts.
Nice. Brad, favorite podcast, or sorry, favorite smartphone app?
Could answer both. Favorite smartphone app would be Signal. It's an encrypted messaging tool.
Awesome. And James Fair?
I'm going with Umail. I get so much spam calls these days that having a tool that blocks those or picks those up for me is very handy.
Interesting. All right. Favorite movie? James Slaby.
There's a couple of classics I could mention, but I think I'll say Tampopo, which is a 1985 comedy from Japan about the obsessive pursuit of the perfect bowl of ramen. It was out of circulation for a while, but you can get it on HBO Max now. Highly recommended.
Very artistic.
And not for kids. It's an adult comedy.
Interesting. Okay, Brad, favorite movie?
I'll go with Apollo 13. It's one of my all-time favorites. Can't go wrong. I'm a big space junkie.
James Fair.
I'm a weird guy. I like Dead Poet Society. I want to empower tomorrow's leaders. That's a thing for me.
Awesome. All right, last rapid fire question. James Slaby, favorite stress reliever?
Blasting loud, energetic music, either classic old school punk or drum and bass electronica from about 20 years ago.
Wow, awesome. Brad, how about you?
I love that one. Taking walks with my 2-year-old dog, I think, is one of my favorite relaxation activities.
Very nice. And James?
Yeah, I'm a big hiker, the doggy and the hiking. And I love to meditate. I meditate every single morning. I think that's a big plus. I recommend that for everyone.
Awesome. Thank you all. Audience, I want to throw out a poll to get us started as well. I'll launch that right now, and that should appear on your screen. We want to ask at the top, and we'll have a couple of these questions throughout the webinar. How confident are you in the security of your organization today? Just as a reminder, these polls are anonymous. Comments will not necessarily be anonymous unless you've named yourself anonymous, which good for you. But the answers to these polls are anonymous, so feel free to answer. Interesting coming in. Yeah, I'm just seeing those polls come in. Great. Okay. So obviously, part of the goal of today's webinar is to help you become a little more confident, at least confident in your knowledge of what steps you might be able to take to better secure your organization. So let's go into some of our topics that we want to discuss today. At the very top, I wanted to touch on one of the largest, if not the largest, breach or hack that we have seen, frankly, ever in the cybersecurity industry, and that's the SolarWinds breach or hack. I'm sure many of you have seen or heard about this on the news. I know that it's happened several months ago, though I did just see some new information about it come out just yesterday. I wanted our panelists to discuss it just briefly because I think it is really important, and I think there's a lot of application to our SMBs out there. And so I will start with James Fair, take the piece and just give us a really quick high-level overview of what went down, what happened with the SolarWinds breach and attack.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. I mean, there's a lot of nuts and bolts and details in this. I'll avoid those. There's a couple of names I'll throw out just so you guys are clear on those in case you hear them again. But yeah, I just want to give you just a quick rundown. So this was caused by or created by the attackers were known as Cozy Bear. This is a Russian, believed to be a hacking arm of Russian foreign intelligence, actually, or it's also seen as APT-29. You'll see that, some of the APT folks. This was done by what's called a compromised update, which is known to be a supply chain attack is what they call it. This isn't your, like wartime supply chain attack, but it is very similar in the process. And we'll talk about that here coming up. I just want to, the people that were impacted was pretty big. On a page that it's been taken down since then, after the news broke out, they had stated, SolarWinds had stated that they had 425 of the US Fortune 500 companies, the top 10 US telecommunication companies, the top 5 US accounting firms, and all branches of the US military, the Pentagon, the State Department, as well as hundreds of universities and colleges worldwide. So I just want to make clear on the scope of this impact of this thing. It was believed to have started as early as March. And remember, the attack happened in December. So 9 months, those folks were likely in there working their thing. This was done through the SolarWinds monitoring tool called Orion. And as I mentioned, it was a supply chain attack. So the way they did that is they impacted the updates that were going out. It's an area we typically think of as a trusted thing. Like when Microsoft sends you a Windows update, we don't verify it, right? We assume it's well. And it also hit a company called FireEye. And FireEye is a US cybersecurity company, and they saw this happening and raised the red flag about it. The update contained a Trojanized component. And the FireEye analysis folks noted that it was really a lot of meticulous and planning and a lot of manual interaction by these attackers. So once they got in through this back door that had a Trojanized component in it, I'll skip some of the details here, but I want to quote this part from these folks. It said, after an initial dormant period of up to 2 weeks, it retrieves and executes commands called jobs that include the ability to transfer files, execute files, profile the system, reboot the machine, and disable system services. The malware masquerades itself as network traffic on the Orion improvement program so that it looked like expected transmission going back and forth. And it was a legitimate plugin, so it kind of blend in with the normal activity. And then did a couple other things to obfuscate, which I think some of my colleagues will get into here a little bit. At first, they kept their footprint really low. They're mostly stealing credentials and trying to move laterally across the systems in order to establish remote access. They used a backdoor access to push a new piece of malware never seen before, which they called Teardrop. There's one of the names I'll give for you. It loads directly into memory and leaves no trace on the disk. This is believed to be a kind of a modified version of Cobalt Strike, which is actually a commercial penetration tool, which unfortunately hackers and cyber criminals have picked up and started to utilize as well. And then a couple techniques they used to avoid detection. They did a file replacement technique. So they would actually replace the file, run the file, and then replace the file back with the original so it wouldn't be detected in the next scan. And they would do a similar process with scheduled tasks. So a scheduled task would start up, they would run the scheduled task, and then put the scheduled task back to the original one. So if someone went and looked, it looked like everything was okay. Really tough to detect. Yeah, I think I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
You bet.
And the 3 areas we want to cover is kind of that overview, and thank you. That was there was a lot going on, frankly, and then we want to talk about a little bit really what went wrong. Kind of why or how did this happen? And James Slavey, why don't you tell us a little bit about that front?
Sure. James covered a lot in his analysis there. I've also shared with Gary a link to an ebook that I just published on behalf of Acronis that goes into some of the more nitty-gritty details of how the attack went down. I think the important thing for our audience to understand is that this is really an advanced persistent threat attack. Like if you remember Stuxnet, something I wrote about as an industry analyst about 10 years ago, that was really a nation state against nation state kind of tool. In this case, bringing down the Iranians' uranium refining operation, jointly mounted by the US and Israel. This is a kind of an early example, or at least one of the first ones we've come to be aware of a nation state, in this case, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, going after not only government institutions, but commercial targets with this really sophisticated long form attack. And it's the sort of attack that you have to have unlimited patience, great skills, and great persistence, and kind of unlimited funds to mount. It's not the sort of thing that cyber criminals do. You know, they're looking for targets of opportunity. If they try to breach your organization and you've got good defenses, they'll move along. They'll try to find an easier, softer target. Advanced persistent threat attacks have no such goals. They will put whatever resources necessary to do it. And stealth is the huge component at every stage of the attack. So the fact that FireEye detected the breach of SolarWinds back in December of last year happened kind of by luck. It wasn't something that they were explicitly looking for. And in the aftermath of the breach, they realized that this thing had been resident in a lot of its targets since autumn of 2019. So that's over a year that this thing was resident, wreaking its mischief and evading detection by the most clever threat hunters and the best cybersecurity organizations in the world. So the bottom line is that if you get targeted, there's a good chance that you're not going to be able to defend against it. So we're going to spend some time talking about what you can do to recover. How forensics and incident response is really important. Again, without going into too many of the details of the attack, the classic APT is you get some initial malware inside the door, and that's usually phishing techniques. You get somebody to click on a email link or attachment that they shouldn't, and that gets the first guy in. He then downloads, gets some of his friends inside the door to surveil the network. That's looking at every endpoint, every piece of hardware, networking and computing hardware, looking at operating system revisions, application revisions, and basically documenting the physical topology, logical topology of the environment, and also cataloging all the potential vulnerabilities that you might exploit. Then the next step is try to escalate privileges so that you can act as trusted insiders who can, with latitude to execute a lot of different operations, move laterally within the network, penetrate as many targets as you can, then trigger your ultimate attack. So this is kind of two-stage. The initial work was about embedding malware into the Orion product. We know this is a wildly popular network management tool. As James said, it's just everywhere. And they did it in such a clever way that it would never cause a build process to fail. So, and kind of give away their game there. So they managed to successfully embed this malware in the Orion tool. With the Orion tool, with its fingers into tens of thousands of government institutions and large enterprises all around the world, they were then able to get their malware inside their targets. Again, a very, James touched on a few of them, the techniques that they used to evade detection at every stage of the attack. So when you communicate to your external command and control servers so that you can download additional malware tools and upload files that you've stolen, you do that using virtual private servers that have been renamed to look like servers that are legitimate in that environment and look like they're in the same country as you, so they don't trigger any kind of behavioral alarms about unusual traffic. When you want to execute a malicious tool, you rename it to look like a legitimate one, you run the process, and when you're done, you delete it. So kind of covering your tracks at every stage of the game. And this is how you managed to go undetected for 18 months. James mentioned the use of a dropper that got malware directly into memory of target machines so that you evade signature-based antivirus scanning techniques. And that's the ultimate object, is to get that payload going. And this is what they use to mine for valuable files and then surreptitiously upload them to their external servers. So the sophistication and the subtlety of the operation is really quite remarkable. And the fact is that we're still uncovering new news about this every day. I mean, this was first uncovered in December, and months later, we're getting new developments every day. There's a new story this morning how NASA and the Federal Aviation Administration were among the compromised targets. And so we haven't heard the end of it. And both these government organizations and these large enterprises are going to spend months trying to root out the remaining traces of the attack to make sure that they don't provide a beachhead for further operations. But encourage you to download my ebook. You'll get the link, I think, in the follow-up email if you're interested in more of the nitty-gritty of it. It plays like the cyber geek version of a heist movie, you know, Ocean's 11 for cyber nerds. It's an incredible story. And as we'll see, something you got to be frightened of a little bit. And once you shake off the initial shock reaction, start taking steps to defend yourself and vetting your own supply chain to make sure that you're not vulnerable there.
Thank you, James. And yeah, knowing how things roll, it'll only be a matter of time before we get a Hollywood movie featuring, you know, cyber hackers trying to get into the US government like that. To sum it up and to kind of transition a little bit, Brad, why don't you speak a little bit to maybe how this could have been prevented? Obviously, it seems there was a lot going on and secrecy again was the hallmark of it, but were there ways that these Fortune 500 companies could have better protected themselves or prevented this?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I completely agree with everything that's been said before. Like James S. was saying that the best of the best wouldn't have been able to detect it because this was a nation state that was doing their absolute best to cover their tracks. So I've seen, and I've been around long enough to see a lot of these large news story data breaches that have occurred. And it's funny because I always chuckle a little bit inside because everybody's like, oh my gosh, what do we do now? And it really all just comes back to the basics. And if you look at the initial access into SolarWinds, it was based, the first access that is publicly known is a horrible password. So good password hygiene is kind of at the core, which is one of the basic principles within security, is to ensure you have strong passwords and that you change them from time to time. The other aspects were things like vulnerability scanning, being able to roll out patches to risky vulnerabilities that you have within your environment. Basically kind of taking that proactive step of hardening your network against attacks like this. So basically mitigating the risk of it occurring in the first place. And the cool thing that we do over at Arctic Wolf is we do those vulnerability scans, but we also monitor networks, and that's really the core of what we do. So the way I like to kind of talk through this is the report came from the FireEye. That was the initial report came on a New York Times article that dropped at like 4 p.m. on a Wednesday. By 1 a.m. on Thursday morning, the Arctic Wolf team had already looked at all of the what are called TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And we implemented rules in our database to actively be monitoring for those indicators of compromise. And then what we did is we went a step further, is we went back and we replayed all of our customer data going back to the initial access and started detecting historically to see if there were any issues in customers' information, and then had a team dedicated to working with customers that potentially would have been affected by this, doing deeper dives into their environment, looking for other indicators of compromise. So again, back to the basics: patch management, password management, and monitoring your environments, I think, are key.
Thank you, Brad. And I think we will cover a little bit more of those basics for our audience in the next few minutes. I wanted to quickly share the results of the poll. I thought it was fairly interesting that people were relatively neutral in terms of their confidence in digital security, but many felt that they were relatively confident. But I'm glad to see that there's always room for improvement. As we often say at Executech, cybersecurity is a journey, not a just destination. And so I think any organization, regardless of the technology they're using, would probably be just and agree that they're confident in their digital security. Let's talk about some other topics. Let's talk about a little bit about 2020. Great year that it was, not so much. What changed in 2020 specifically around cybersecurity, and how are things different now? And I'll push that over to James first, but then just have this a general discussion. James Fair, excuse me.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. We're picky about that one. Sorry. I think the greatest thing for at least that we saw at Executech was the work from home environment. Everyone left the office where we'd spent all this time and effort to set up a secure environment where people could work, relatively free of attacks. That was the idea. Then they all went home and got on their personal computers and went to work. And cybersecurity folks were left going, we hope this works out okay to some degree. So a big push was, for our perspective, was learning how to secure those folks. And I think we're seeing a lot of products come to solve this too. We're starting to see those launch. I'm not surprised. I knew that would happen. We're going to see a lot of products come out that will solve this how do we work from home securely solution. So that's my answer.
James S., what are your thoughts?
So absolutely, that shift to remote work was a huge one. Ransomware has been a pet subject of mine, and of course, Acronis, among our data protection and cybersecurity capabilities, is really strong anti-ransomware capability. But those guys did not relent at all with their attacks. If anything, they had more time on their hands, not being able to go outside and run around themselves. So that we saw the scale and sophistication and targeting, increased sophistication of tactics, exfiltrating and threatening to leak data, or holding the threat of a DDoS attack over victims to get them to pay without trying to recover first. The other big thing was a kind of a much more aggressive shift to SaaS applications of necessity because of the pandemic. And that hit a lot of organizations a little bit flat-footed. A lot of operations groups didn't have the kind of configuration experience or chops, and often made mistakes that left SaaS data and applications vulnerable to attack. So remote work, ransomware, and the move to SaaS really opened up a lot of problems for businesses out there.
The home environment, man, the wild unknown. Brad, what are your thoughts? What changed in 2020?
Yeah, I think around the horn you're hearing, work from home is a big thing. I would completely agree with that. People, taking your corporate environment and now expanding it up to millions of Wild West homes, if you will. It's become a greater issue for the broader community as a whole. I guess my other big takeaway is similar to what James was saying. We've seen a huge increase of the number of vulnerabilities that have been identified and the number of attackers that are exploiting them. So it's been pretty wild to see that the criminals out there know that corporate networks are dispersed and harder to protect, and they're taking advantage of it by working overtime and putting in the extra hours. I also think it's an interesting thing that a lot of security researchers are doing the exact same thing. They're at home, their workload might be not as heavy as it normally would. So they're doing a ton of research and identifying some really interesting issues. I think most notably, not last year technically, but early this year, was new malware that affects Mac and every version of Mac chips, which I think is a very interesting thing and might signal a bit of a shift in the industry.
Awesome. Thank you. I wanted to share another poll with our audience here really quick. I'm curious about this. What is your number one worry when it comes to cybersecurity for your business or your organization? I have a guess of what might be the number one. And frankly, all of these are worries. And I think we'll cover a little bit of these. Again, we want to start it up front and talk a little bit about all of the risks, all of the problems, but we do want to get into some of the prevention and protection, of course, as this poll comes in. We'll just give this poll just a few seconds and then I'll go ahead and share it so everyone can see the results here. I do want to ask just real quickly, diving into the prevention side of things. Well, let's cover that a little bit later, and I'll go into another question. So we've talked a little bit about 2020 and what's come out of that, and work from home is kind of the big one. Now that we're here in 2021, I think we anticipate some form of a hybrid environment likely this year. But what are some other or new cyber concerns that we see coming on the horizon this year that we need to be watching out for? James Slaby, I'll pull that over to you first.
Yeah, I think we're bound to see a lot more of the same. Just for starters here, it looks increasingly like, depending on your industry, anywhere from 30% to 70% of your workers are going to spend a lot less time in an office, that remote work is going to continue to be a much larger part of the norm than it was pre-pandemic. So protecting this rickety home infrastructure, my crummy commercial grade, consumer grade Wi-Fi and cable router, and the other, making sure my kid doesn't get on my computer and start toying around with it while I'm out for a run, kind of thing. If we look a little further down the horizon, particularly if you're coming from a large enterprise environment, there's a good chance that you're going to be dabbling with things like 5G. And particularly if you're in a field like manufacturing, the Internet of Things is becoming a growing part of your infrastructure. Those devices very often, if there's a vulnerability, the only way to patch it is by tossing the device and replacing it. They're not upgradable. So 5G itself is still terra incognita for a lot of organizations, definitely a wider data path, much more distributed, much likely to enable much wider connectivity of a greater number of devices. That's not a big concern for everyone, but those are, I think, one of the interesting frontiers of cybersecurity that we're going to have to wrestle with, if not by the end of this year, certainly into 2022.
Absolutely. Brad, do you have anything to add in terms of maybe what we're seeing this year that's new?
Yeah, and I don't know if this is necessarily going to be like any sort of threat or anything crazy like that, but I think you're going to see a big emergence of CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. I think that not only has the DoD publicly said that they, and actually enabled, that they're going to be now adding that into a lot of contracts. So you'll see that spread out. So if you're a DoD contractor, make sure that that's on your, right now you need to be planning for list, because you do have to show historical adherence to CMMC, which is a really important thing. So it's not a wait and then see what happens kind of a thing. So I think that's going to be a really big area of conversation throughout this year. Other governmental organizations have also jumped in and said that they were going to be enforcing CMMC on contracts. Department of Homeland Security has said that, as well as the GSA has publicly said that as well. And we do expect probably one other to come forth and say they're going to start adding it to contracts. But I think that's going to be a pretty big change that will hit a lot of the defense industry base pretty hard this year.
I think there's a lot of industries hit by compliance in a variety of ways also that it's kind of a little bit of a wake-up call. James, what thoughts do you have? We did have a commenter mention that there are a lot of unknown unknowns out there, which, yeah, that's the rub. But tell us what you think may be coming this coming year.
I think my colleague summed it up really well and covered the vast majority of it. The only thing I might add, I think we're going to see a big push for change detection. That's one of the ways we can start to look for some of this stuff. If a user gets created out of the blue, if a user uses a computer they've never used before, if a user jumps on at 2 a.m. So I think we're going to start looking at more behavioral based models and less reactive type models. That's my hope anyway, from the cybersecurity aspect. Ransomware, as James said, but the rest they covered really well.
Awesome, thank you. Sharing the results of our recent poll here, it seems that one of the #1 worries is a data breach. And so kind of speaking to that, we mentioned that a little bit with the SolarWinds story, and that how preventable was it? And so it kind of became a question of what was your response plan? I wanted to just have a brief discussion around how businesses and business leaders can prepare for a breach. Obviously, we want to touch on prevention. I think we'll get on that a little bit later, but let's just assume the worst, that it was extremely sophisticated or simple mistakes were made and a breach has happened. What do you do to prepare for that? What should be in place so that you can get back on your feet after a breach? Brad, how about I go to you first again, and let's touch on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think proactive monitoring is going to be a really important part of that. If you don't have logs, you're not going to be able to figure out how anything happened. So have logs, that way you can actually review to see what had occurred, and then have them proactively monitored. Have your networks proactively monitored. That way you can identify quicker, right? Rather than letting something lie dormant within your networks, which is how a vast majority of attacks actually happen. Is something gets in, it sits dormant for a while, and then things start to happen and things start to crumble. So if you have teams that are skilled watching over your environments 24/7 and identifying those early indicators, I think that will go a long way.
Awesome, thank you. James S., what do you see as some of the steps that should be taken in a disaster recovery or incident response strategy and plan for a business?
Well, I frankly am a believer in both of them, and starting with disaster recovery, cloud-based disaster recovery services make the prospect of being able to fail over when a primary site or collection of applications is hit a lot more affordable and manageable, even for smaller businesses. It's not just for large enterprises anymore. And we see that with things like what just happened in Texas with their power grid, that the environment has gotten chaotic enough out there, climate change driven, that you may think that historically your area may have been relatively invulnerable to those kind of things, but I think we're all starting to see that those environmental risks are getting greater for all of us. But the bottom line is understanding in the wake of something like a SolarWinds attack that if you get in the sights of these bad guys, and they don't have to be nation state actors, even cyber criminal gangs have gotten much more sophisticated, or taking advantage of machine learning and AI kind of tools to increase the sophistication and successful targeting of their attacks, that you're going to get hit at some point. So incident response planning becomes really important. And that's something that has got to go beyond your IT and your cybersecurity group. You've got to pull in every aspect, every group of the organization that in any way is touched by this kind of risk, from your senior leadership on down. You've got to think about how you communicate the progress of your response to an incident to your customers, to your partners, to your investors, if you're a public company. And you got to rehearse that stuff, right? If you're pulling your response plan off the shelf for the first time in the wake of an incident, you're doing it wrong. So really scheduling regular drills, exercising and refining that plan is really, really important. An unrehearsed plan is not worth much.
Great advice. Thank you, James S. James Fair, anything to add there on the incident response approach?
My colleagues covered the kind of the general broads of the whole thing. I actually have done this recently. I've been spent the last couple of months diving into an incident response plan. So I'm just going to kind of list the main topics that we found that were relevant to an IRP, and maybe that will help someone create a framework for them. And I can post it in the chat or something. But just real quick off the cuff, roles and responsibilities. Who's doing what? If and when. Hopefully, it never happens to anyone. If it does, who's doing what? Contact info for everyone, including your legal contact. That's a big one, right? Who am I going to contact? Who do I call? You don't want to be searching phone numbers and trying to find a lawyer after the fact or when a breach may be happening. Post detection and analysis. After you're done and you're back up, what are you going to do to prevent it? How are you going to analyze it? Containment would be the next one, right? So how do we find this thing? How do we stop this thing? Eradication and recovery. How do we get rid of it? How do we get back? Post-incident activity, what did we learn from it? Those kind of things. And then afterward would be communications and notifications, the things these gentlemen referred to. Do we need to hire a PR firm? How do we communicate this out to the public? And who do we contact? What's appropriate? Those kind of things. You do not want to be trying to do this in the middle of an incident, I promise.
Great advice. Again, thank you. I want to launch another poll for our audience here. One of our last ones here. What do you think is the best way to protect your business, the best approach, the best tactic? And I intentionally left this one as a multiple choice selection because now I want to go in with our panelists and talk a little bit about what are the tactics? What are the things that you can do? And we'll start with some of the 101s. And I'll ask you, James S., what are some of the tried and true 101 ways? We alluded to them at the beginning, again, with SolarWinds. It does, as Brad said, come back to the basics. What are some of those basics? Share some of that with us, James.
Well, the research that I collect and sometimes conduct on behalf of Acronis shows that the email remains far and away the most common attack vector for malware incursions, which suggests that 30 or 40 years into this technology, we still haven't really figured out how to use it safely. And that's just one tactic of many that are going to continue to evolve in sophistication and get the benefit of greater automation, greater scale. The malware business has been industrialized at this point. They operate like Salesforce, but for evil. The small group of clever developers on the back end, and then the army of distributors out there that don't necessarily have great cracking skills, but are good at getting their product onto your endpoint. So that suggests to me that we can never pay enough attention to security awareness training from the top on down, and especially maybe the top these days, since targeted attacks increasingly go after senior leaders because they're the ones with the power to move money and do other things, or they generally have good credentials or access to valuable resources. So keep hitting your employees with ways to kind of hone their sensitivity, their antennae for potential threats, because all the great defenses that you might build in the world aren't worth much if you got people opening the back door and letting the bad guys in.
Great advice, great topics, and I think I'll share the results here of this, which reflect well, I think, on what you've just shared. Training was the #1 pick. Well done, audience. I think that's a great pick for our #1. James Fair, I'll go over to you and just, again, what are some of the 101 tried and true ways of cyber protection?
Well, I'm going to call it my colleagues here first. Have backups. Use his product. Have someone monitoring your network. Use this goes this way. Use his product. Have someone, if you're, I don't know about you guys, but if I know some engineers are watching my entire network of the traffic going in and out of it, I'm going to sleep better at night. So that's a big one. Some of the easy ones, right? MFA, that's a big thing we're doing nowadays. Put MFA on everything, please. Your personal accounts, everything, everywhere. There's still some vendors that aren't allowing you to do that. Put pressure on those folks. We cannot let login and password be the only way we get into our bank, other things like that. And these days, MFA should be an app. Don't have it text your phone. Phones can be stolen. Your phone can be cloned. Have it go to an app instead. Personally, I use a different email address for anything to do with banking or money. I actually have 3 email addresses for personal. I've got one I send all my family that I communicate with, family and friends. I have one that I interact with any kind of shopping online. I'm gonna put that email address. I don't care what goes to that. And I use a third one just for banking, and nothing else goes on there. It's the only place I'll use it. So hopefully it doesn't get out. It seems like a little bit of overkill, but as my colleague mentioned, email is the method of attack these days. So I want to be a bit safer about it. And I've seen it happen. I don't know if you guys had this experience. I mean, I should say the story, but I woke up one morning to my phone and it had a whole line of these issues to request my password reset all the way down my phone. I woke up at 6 a.m. to see it that way and panicked because that was my bank and my crypto and other stuff. So yeah, that's not there anymore. Couple of quick things. I mean, the obvious ones, right? Firewall, antivirus, pretty much the whole list he had on the poll there. Spam filtering. And the one people don't often think of, I highly recommend, is how does our company appear to the hackers? So have someone do an external scan on your network, because that's what the hackers are looking at. I assure you, they're doing port scans, they're doing things that are from the outside. What is your appearance? What's your vector look like? And do you have any ports open that they're going to go after? Because the whole world, once you plug in the internet, the whole world is looking at you. So make sure you've got it plugged as much as possible. I'll stop. Thank you.
Great topics, great advice. We'll touch on that just a little bit more. Just quickly before I go to Brad, I do want to remind our audience, if you do have any questions, please drop them in the chat. You've got these 3 cyber experts here for free. They'll answer any question you've got. Get them while you've got them. So, but Brad, what are some of the 101 tactics that you would use to protect and defend against attacks?
Yeah, I think both Jameses have had very, very good points that they've delivered, and I think they're very much so something that you should implement immediately. I'm a big fan of choosing a security framework and then working the framework, building out your security policies, building out your security posture based upon that. And that can be a difficult thing. So I'm a big fan of the Center for Internet Security's top 20 critical security controls. What's really cool about that is it leverages some of the other big frameworks that are out there, and it prioritizes them based upon known data breach information, meaning that you literally start at 1 and you work your way to 20 from a high level. So I'm a really big fan of that. And oftentimes when I refer to the basics, there's a category which covers the first 6 controls called the basics category within Center for Internet Security's top 20 critical security controls. So those are: understand what you have, do vulnerability scanning on your stuff and patch the equipment, make sure you have things properly hardened, so secure configuration, and then it kind of wraps up with audit logging and monitoring of your networks.
Awesome, thank you, Brad. Again, I wanted to keep us at about 45 minutes. There are a couple of questions that came in, so I do want to pose them to the group. And again, if you do have any other questions come up, please ask them. One that we had come in is, why was the out traffic not detected in the SolarWinds case? And they said that it is one thing to make sure no one gets in, but there should have been a trigger when unusual amounts of packets were going out. And then what tools could have been used to detect that? James Slaby, I'll go ahead and have you start with that, and if the others have comments, you can jump in.
Sure. One of the nice things when you have the luxury of an APT is that you can take a long time. You spend a lot of time embedding yourself in the environment in such a way that you're not easily detected, and then you trickle out data slowly over time, and you set your the target servers that you're going to look like normal targets of traffic. So the way the Cozy Bear folks did this was with virtual private servers that looked like they were in the United States or Europe or the Middle East, wherever it was adjacent to their particular targets. and trickled that out. They made it look like normal SolarWinds API protocol traffic. That's another thing, is like you may detect the traffic, but it looks innocuous because it's successfully hiding in it. You can also, it's very easy to expostulate that these folks, the attackers had built a kind of a virtual SolarWinds mock-up and spent months testing every stage of the attack to make sure that that it didn't set off the alarms of the presumed security countermeasures that SolarWinds would have in place, and refined those techniques internally in their kind of test bed before they ever went out and started the attack live. But patience is a huge tactic that they took advantage of. Anytime they made an initial penetration of a target, they'd go dormant for as long as 2 weeks, and that there were long periods between every stage of the attack where they would do absolutely nothing, or do very minor things to see what alarm bells might have been set off. So when you've got the luxury of taking as much time in the world as you need to do it, you can slow roll those kind of things to keep them under the threshold of behavioral countermeasures that are designed to detect anomalous behaviors.
Awesome. Any comments from James F. or Brad on that?
There is a method to check for the file changing. If you can look for, it's like, I'll have to look up the sequence, but it's replace a file, delete a file, replace a file. If you look for that happening in your network, that's that file replacement technique that was utilized in there. Not a great answer, but it's a start.
Great. A couple other quick questions, and then we'll end here. Just a reminder to our audience, there is a giveaway available. We'll talk a little bit more about that after we answer these last questions here. Somebody asked how to guard the link, sync, and team sharing and remote desktop. Might need a little more details on that, but I guess just those particular applications, how to protect them, maybe. James Fair, any comment on that?
It's a bunch of different things in here. I'm not familiar with Sync, Teams, and Remote Desktop. Teams is a cloud-based app. Let's start with Remote Desktop. So Remote Desktop of any kind should only be done over a VPN, really. And I'm sure my colleagues will probably say a similar scenario. We don't want to direct connect to anything. We don't want anything open on the internet that we can direct connect to. We need a VPN connection that we establish first from wherever we are, so we're securely connected, and then be allowed access to anything that our system, all work resources like that.
Great. Any other comments on that one?
The only thing that I would add in would be, sorry, James.
No, go ahead.
Make sure you keep your software updated. That's a pretty important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Vulnerability scanning and patch management. When it comes to collaboration apps, cloud-based apps like Teams and Zoom and so forth, there are vendors out there that have tools that are explicitly designed to add security to those environments. So if you've got specific concerns, a little research will uncover some specific measures, and I'm sure there's tons of salespeople out there that'd be happy to talk to you about it.
Awesome. So the last question that we've gotten that I think is a great one to end on, a little bit back to the 101 question: what can a small business do with no IT department to protect itself? James Fair, why don't you take that, and then we'll branch.
Yeah, it was covered a little bit, well earlier by Brad. Do a risk analysis. Where is our highest risk, and start there. There's a graph. You can see that starting out in security, changing passwords and those things don't cost much to do. Pretty easy to implement, don't cost much. And as you work your way up that security grade, it begins to get more expensive and more costly and more time consuming to do that. But there's so much runway before you ever get there. There are hundreds of things that we can do, password changes, MFA, even before you get to where you have to spend any money. But I would do a risk analysis and figure out where your greatest risk is and start there. That's my answer.
Awesome. Any other comments from James Slavey or Brad?
Certainly. I would say if it were my department and I had no headcount and no budget, I would look to outsource some of my pain. So nowadays you can look to managed service providers who can deliver the kind of fill in the kind of gaps that you're suffering from. And because they're doing it across multiple customers and can attract and retain talent better than you can, and do it at scale, that they're going to be able to do it much more cost effectively. They're much more likely to have the kind of integrated sets of tools and automation brought to bear that avoids the kind of silos between categories of security countermeasures that provide opportunities for vulnerabilities that cyber criminals can slip through. So look to external help. There's probably a managed service provider that can do it for you more cheaply than you can do it yourself. Also, by the way, that turns it into an operating expense, not depreciating capital investments and your own labor overhead costs.
Couldn't have said it better ourselves, James. Brad, anything to add on that one?
James S. stole the words right out of my mouth.
Awesome. Well, I know we've gone a little bit over our intended time. I think this has been a great discussion. We've had a lot of topics, a lot of points come up. I hope our audience has enjoyed it. We appreciate all of you for coming out and hearing this. We know that cybersecurity is a really important, really big issue for businesses of all sizes, and that's why we want to put this content out and continually bring together experts to share their expertise. So just another big shout out and thank you to James Slaby from Acronis and Brad Hanley from Arctic Wolf, and of course, James Fair from Executech. Before everyone jumps off, I do want to let you know, we've mentioned it a couple of times, this idea of a vulnerability scan or a port scan. I'm happy and excited to announce that all registrants or attendees of this webinar, we are making this a vulnerability scan available for free to all of you to sign up for. I'm going to drop the link in the chat, but this link will also go out as you leave the webinar and also in a follow-up email. This scan comes from our friends at Arctic Wolf. And again, as has been mentioned by Brad and James Fair and James Slaby, that this type of a scan will help you understand some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in your network environment. It's a little bit technical even for me, but we will have IT experts standing by to help you understand what the results of this scan are and what steps you can take to better protect your environment. And again, that is free and available to everyone who's registered and attended this event. In addition to that, if you register for the vulnerability scan, let me just share this image here. We will be giving away, there's a little picture of the scan there. We will be giving away these 3 items. So if you enter in for the scan, you will also submit for the scan. You'll get the vulnerability scan, and we'll talk about that. But you'll also be entered to win one of these 3 prizes. Again, we had some awesome prizes submitted from our friends at Acronis, a signed Arsenal soccer ball, an Arctic Wolf brought us a Yeti mug, and then we also have a cool Cotopaxi backpack, Executech branded. So if you want a shot at one of those, submit for the scan and you'll be eligible to be entered to win. Again, thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks again for our panelists. Oh, James, sorry. Yeah, you're not eligible to win any of those.
I want that Arsenal soccer ball myself.
It's pretty cool. Okay. Thanks again, everybody. Hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. It's great to see you.